You slept early. No caffeine. No phone. No bad dreams. Just silence. And 8 full hours. And yet, when morning comes, you wake up tired. Again. Your body isn't broken. You followed all the rules. So why does your soul still feel like it's dragging itself through the day? In Buddhism, there's a forgotten teaching. One that whispers, you don't heal tiredness by sleeping more. You heal it by letting go of the self you keep trying to be. This is not a video about fixing your sleep. It's about remembering what real rest feels like. And the story of a young monk who thought he was disciplined, but was secretly exhausted from holding everything together. Stay with me, because in part 5, you'll hear the moment his tiredness became his teacher, and how that moment may quietly mirror your own. And if this resonates with your quiet mornings, subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings, because sometimes healing begins with simply being heard. Part 1, The Tired Monk. It was still dark when he opened his eyes. The sky outside the paper window had not yet softened to blue. The air in the monastery was cool, scented faintly with cedarwood and the lingering breath of last night's incense. A bell had not rung, no bird had sung, and yet his eyes opened, unwillingly, wearily. The young monk lay still. His name was Kai, and for the 4th morning in a row, he felt as though he hadn't slept at all. He had done everything right. He had followed the schedule. No late tea, no heavy thoughts before bed. His robes were folded, his mind was clear, or at least, he thought it was. And yet, each morning, it felt like he had returned from a journey he couldn't remember, as if his body had rested, but his spirit had never stopped walking. He sat up slowly, rubbing the weight from his eyes. In the silence, the monastery around him breathed, ancient wood creaking softly, wind brushing against bamboo stalks in the courtyard. The others were still asleep, their breaths even and untroubled. But in Kai's chest, a dull ache hummed like a bell struck too many times. Why do I feel so tired? He whispered to himself. When I did everything right, and maybe you've asked yourself the same. You follow the advice. Eat clean. Avoid screens. Wind down before bed. And yet, when the sun arrives, you feel more worn than rested, like life has become something you endure, rather than something you enter. There's a quiet kind of suffering in that. Not dramatic, not loud, just persistent. Kai wrapped his shawl around his shoulders and stepped out into the hallway. The stones were cold beneath his bare feet. He moved quietly toward the meditation hall, hoping the stillness might offer answers. But the moment he stepped inside, he found his teacher already there. Master Hojin was seated by the open window, back straight, eyes closed, face lit faintly by the pre-dawn light. He did not move when Kai entered. He didn't need to. He always seemed to know. Kai bowed and sat across from him, careful not to disturb the hush that had settled like mist between them. Minutes passed, and then, still without opening his eyes, the teacher spoke. You are here early, yet your spirit arrived late. Kai blinked. It was not a question. It was a reflection, and it landed deep. I couldn't sleep, Kai replied softly. Hojin finally opened his eyes, calm, clear, unblinking. No, he said, you did sleep, but you didn't let go. There it was, the first lesson. And maybe that's true for us too. We sleep, but we don't surrender. We close our eyes, but our minds stay clenched, still holding conversations that never ended, regrets we never buried, fears that won't be named out loud. Kai lowered his gaze. I thought I had let everything go. I don't feel worried. I don't feel afraid. Hojin smiled, gently. Feeling is not the measure. Emptiness is. Kai was silent, not from confusion, but because something inside him knew the teacher was right. He had been going through the motions of peace without touching its heart. His body had obeyed the routine, but his spirit had never truly arrived at rest. And that is a quiet wound many of us carry. We check all the boxes, wellness, productivity, spirituality even, but beneath it all there is a tension, like trying to float while clinging to stones. We want to be well, but we are still holding so much. So the teacher invited Kai to sit. not to meditate, but to simply sit. "Today," said Hojin, "you will not chase stillness. You will not fix tiredness. You will simply sit and see what arises." And so Kai sat. No mantra, no breath count, no goal, just silence. But it is within that kind of silence that truth begins to stir. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet revelation. I am tired, not because I didn't sleep. I am tired because I never stopped holding. And so he sat, and the morning deepened, and we will return to see what he discovers. Part 2. The things we carry into sleep. Kai sat in silence. The stone floor beneath him was cold, but not uncomfortable. The morning air, still laced with night's breath, wrapped around his shoulders like a thin shawl. There was no mantra to anchor him, no bell to guide him, no structure to protect him from his own mind. It was just him, and the noise that waited beneath the quiet. First, there was nothing, just breath, just stillness. But then, slowly, the mind began to reveal its collection. Like a child emptying its pockets after a long day, pebble by pebble, Kai's thoughts began to surface. A small worry about an unanswered letter to his sister. A flicker of embarrassment from yesterday's chanting, when his voice cracked. An old dream of becoming something more than just a monk. And then, a deep, aching memory of his mother, now long gone. He hadn't thought of her in weeks. But in this silence, she returned. Her face not in pain, not in joy, just presence. And with her presence, a heaviness he didn't know he was carrying. It dawned on him, like a light creeping in under a door. We don't carry burdens because we want to. We carry them because we forgot they were still in our hands. Each night, Kai had laid down his body, but his heart had stayed clenched. His mind had slipped into dreams, but his spirit had never exhaled. And isn't that what so many of us do? We think sleep will heal us, but what we're truly craving is surrender. There's a teaching in Buddhism, simple but devastatingly true. What you do not release by day will visit you by night. It's not just stress that robs us of rest. It's the incomplete conversations, the unspoken grief, the unforgiven regrets that follow us into bed like shadows we can't shake. Kai sat still, watching these thoughts arise. He didn't judge them, didn't wrestle with them. He just saw them, and in seeing, something softened. His teacher, still seated across the room, had not spoken again. But Kai felt him, not as a voice, but as a presence, as if the walls of the monastery themselves were teaching now. He remembered a phrase Hojin had said once, almost in passing: "Sleep is not an escape, it is a mirror." And suddenly that mirror became very clear. Kai had been using sleep the way many of us do, as a door to slam shut on the day. But in truth, the door never fully closes. The unfinished energy leaks through. The body may rest, but the soul keeps turning over what it didn't resolve. He thought of the way he brushed past his friend yesterday without looking. The way he smiled even when he felt hollow. The way he told himself, "I'm okay," without ever checking if it was true. And all of it had followed him into sleep. So much of our exhaustion doesn't come from what we do, but from what we hide. Our busyness is not always the problem. It's the weight of everything we pretend doesn't bother us. The silent tension, the unspoken pain, the inner conflict we push aside until it becomes background noise in our dreams. Kai's breathing deepened, not because he forced it, but because something within him had released just a little. He didn't need to fix everything right now. He didn't need to understand it all. He just needed to see what he was carrying and begin to put it down. Outside, the sky was beginning to change. Not sunrise yet, but that sacred in-between time when night begins to exhale. Kai didn't move, but in his stillness, something had shifted. He didn't feel energized. He didn't feel joyful. But for the first time in days, he felt honest. And sometimes that's where real rest begins. The body will always need sleep, but the soul, it needs space. And as he sat there, one quiet breath at a time, Kai realized he had not come here to force sleep, but to remember how to let go. Part 3: The deep exhaustion of the self. The sky had begun its slow turning. Out beyond the temple courtyard, the black of night was retreating gently into a softened gray, the kind of gray that held no opinion, no judgment, just space, a hush of neutrality before the sun makes its entrance. Kai remained seated, cross-legged on the worn tatami mat, as still as the statues carved into the alcoves nearby. But inside, he wasn't still at all. Something had stirred, not loud, not violent, but definite. It was as though the silence had become a scalpel, slicing gently through the outer layers of his fatigue. The surface tiredness that comes from walking, chanting, cleaning, and revealing something much deeper underneath. A tiredness, not of the body, not even of the mind, but of the self. He didn't understand it at first. It wasn't a concept his training had covered explicitly, but it pulsed through him like a bell after it struck. There was a kind of exhaustion that came not from doing too much, but from being someone all the time. The image he held of himself, the diligent monk, the quiet one, the one who always showed up, the one who didn't complain. Each role, each identity, even the noble ones, had become another layer of effort. The deepest tiredness, his teacher had once whispered during a walking meditation, is trying to hold yourself together when you don't even know who that self is anymore. Kai now understood. He wasn't just tired because of his daily routines. He was tired from performing his piece, from keeping up the image of serenity, while something in him was quietly unraveling. He had thought enlightenment meant always being calm. But now, sitting in this raw honesty, he saw, even monks can get lost in pretending. That realization didn't shame him. It relieved him, because for the first time he could admit he was trying too hard to be someone who was already enough. From across the meditation hall, Hojin finally spoke. His voice didn't cut through the silence. It moved with it, like a reed bending with the wind. You are not tired from living. You are tired from performing life. Kai's eyes lifted. The teacher wasn't looking at him. He was looking out the window, at the branches swaying, the faint morning mist still clinging to the trees. When the self becomes too heavy, the master continued, even stillness feels like effort. Kai felt something inside him drop, like a knot quietly loosening in his belly. No drama, no tears, just release. We don't realize how much of our exhaustion comes from trying to be someone. To be the good partner, the strong leader, the wise parent, the spiritual one. To be the version of ourselves that others will love, or at least not leave. But each role, even the kind ones, demands energy. And when they pile up day after day, night after night, they start to drain the soul. There is a weariness, Hojin said gently, that no rest can fix, because it is not of the body. It is of the self clinging to its own image. Kai took a slow breath in. This time, it didn't feel like a monk breathing. It didn't feel like a student trying to understand. It just felt like a human being exhaling for the first time in days. He looked down at his hands. How long had he been holding on to the idea of who he was supposed to be? Even monks are not free from ego. The ego just wears softer robes. But in this moment, something shifted. Not in the way the world loves to call transformational. Not loud, not sudden, just real. A subtle softening, a loosening of the grip, as if a lifetime of holding himself together had finally been given permission to fall apart. And in that falling apart was the beginning of true rest, because rest is not escape. It is the return to what is already whole. Outside, a bird called. Kai turned his head slightly, not to chase the sound, but to honor it. For the first time, he was not trying to be anything in this silence. He was simply present, not as a monk, not as an idea, but as the very thing the Buddha spoke of again and again, a being simply breathing. And sometimes that's all healing asks of us. Part 4, the morning ritual of non-doing. The sound of the bird faded, but its echo stayed in Kai's chest, not as a note, but as a reminder. Life is always speaking, when we stop trying to interrupt it. Master Hojin stood slowly, the way an old pine tree might rise if it ever chose to walk. His body moved with the ease of someone who no longer rushed toward meaning, but allowed it to reveal itself. He did not beckon Kai to follow. He simply began walking. Kai rose wordlessly and walked behind him through the monastery. The corridors were still bathed in the pale gray of early dawn. No one else was awake. No one else needed to be. The teacher walked past the meditation hall, past the courtyard, past even the bell tower. He walked toward the back of the temple, to the garden that monks rarely visited before sunrise. It was wild here, untamed, not landscaped or controlled. "Sit," Hojin said quietly, and lowered himself onto a moss-covered stone beneath an old tree. Kai followed, but he waited, not because he didn't know what to do, but because for once, he didn't feel the urge to do anything. And that, the teacher finally said, is the point. "This," he whispered, "is the morning ritual of non-doing." Kai glanced over. Was this a practice? Was this a metaphor? Was he supposed to meditate? Breathe in a certain way? "No effort," Hojin said, as if reading the thoughts. "No technique. No intention to improve. Just be with what is." Kai looked around the garden. The dew on the grass. The way light filtered gently through the leaves. Not in beams but in whispers. The slight curve of the earth beneath him. There was no need to add anything. Nothing to fix. Nothing to chase. And in that realization, he felt his breath begin to slow. Not because he forced it, but because it no longer had to run. We spend so much of our lives trying to become something. Even in rest, we strive to rest better. Even in sleep, we strategize how to wake up refreshed. Even in meditation, we want to achieve peace. But there is a place deeper than all of that. Place beneath effort, where the soul doesn't need to be led, just remembered. And here, in this garden, Kai was being led back. "Do you see," Hojin asked gently, "that your exhaustion is not because you are broken, but because you've spent your life trying not to be?" Kai looked down. His hands were open now. He hadn't even noticed them unclench. There was something holy in the way the wind moved through the tall grass. Something sacred in the way the clouds drifted without direction. A kind of wisdom in the unstructuredness of it all. And maybe that was the teaching. The earth rests, the clouds rest, even the sun takes its time to rise. But we force ourselves to bloom before we're ready, to shine before the fog has lifted, to answer before the question has fully formed. We exhaust ourselves not with action, but with expectation. Expectation to be better, to be wise, to be healed, to be okay, even when we're not. And so this morning ritual was not about doing anything. It was about remembering that you don't have to. For 15 minutes they sat. No talking, no breathing exercises, no posture corrections. Just two beings, one old, one young, wrapped in the presence of a moment that didn't ask them to improve it. Kai's tiredness didn't vanish, but it softened. It no longer screamed. It no longer felt like a punishment. Felt understandable, like a child who had stayed up all night waiting for their parent to come home. All his tiredness had ever wanted was to be acknowledged, and now it was. "We do not heal by escaping tiredness," Hojin said, rising again. "We heal by witnessing it without shame." The teacher turned and began walking back to the monastery. Kai followed, but something about him had changed. He no longer walked as the tired monk trying to wake up. He walked as a soul who had learned that sometimes rest is not a nap. It is the end of pretending. In part 5, Kai will be asked a question that turns everything upside down. What if your tiredness is not the problem, but the invitation? A doorway into the deepest Buddhist truth of all. Non-attachment to who you think you must be. Part 5, the invitation hidden in your tiredness. Later that morning, after the usual temple routines began, after the sweeping of leaves, the lighting of incense, and the rhythmic chants that echoed through old wooden beams, Kai returned to his room. He sat by the small window overlooking the garden. The same garden where, just hours before, he had experienced something he still couldn't quite name. It wasn't enlightenment. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even peace in the way he had imagined peace should feel. It was more like a quiet permission to stop trying so hard to be okay. And now, sitting here alone, a single question whispered in his mind. He didn't know where it came from, whether it was something his teacher had said or something that had bloomed in the stillness. But it came clear as a temple bell. What if your tiredness isn't something to fix? What if it's not a flaw, but a message? What if it's not the problem, but the doorway? Kai closed his eyes. The thought landed like a pebble dropped into a pond, quiet, but with deep-reaching ripples. You see, most of us meet our exhaustion with fear. We interpret it as weakness. We fight it, medicate it, ignore it. We search for routines, supplements, mantras, anything to feel energized again. But what if the fatigue isn't a malfunction, but a messenger? In Buddhism, there is a story of a student who traveled for months to reach a great Zen master, desperate for awakening. When he arrived, he begged to be taught the truth that would set him free. The master looked at him and said simply, "Go sleep." The student was stunned, offended even. "I came all this way to learn the Dharma," he insisted. And the master replied, "You did not come to learn. You came to perform. And your performance is what makes you tired." Kai had heard the story before, but he never truly understood it. Until now, he thought of how much of his life, even his spiritual life, had been performance. Waking early not out of joy, but duty. Sitting in meditation not to connect, but to be seen as disciplined. Smiling when he was empty. Saying, "I'm okay," when he wasn't even sure who was speaking. This was the true cause of tiredness. Not lack of sleep, but the endless pressure to be someone. Fatigue, he realized, is not always physical depletion. Sometimes it's the body's way of saying, "This version of you is too heavy to carry anymore." And perhaps the most compassionate thing we can do in moments like this is not to push through, not to fix, but to listen. Kai opened his eyes and looked around his tiny room. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. There was no burst of energy, no great insight that filled him with purpose, just a soft, steady presence. His tiredness was still there, but now it felt less like a burden and more like a teacher with no words, no robes, no chants, only a message. You are allowed to stop trying to be who you are not. And in that moment, something within him exhaled. He wasn't healed. He wasn't enlightened, but he was no longer hiding. And sometimes that's where healing begins. The next morning, Kai would wake up before the bell. Not because he forced himself, but because his soul had finally rested. And in part 6, he will share tea with Master Hojin, who will offer him a story from the Buddha's own life. A story that reveals why the most awakened beings were never the ones who tried the hardest, but the ones who knew when to rest. Shall we continue with part 6, the tea story and the wisdom of stopping? The next morning, there was no bell to wake Kai, and yet, he opened his eyes before the first chime of metal met morning air. It wasn't energy that pulled him from sleep. It wasn't duty either. It was something softer, like being gently nudged by the world, not for a task, but for an invitation. He sat up slowly, not because he had to, but because he wanted to meet the day. There was still tiredness in his bones, yes, but it was no longer something he feared. It had become a companion, like a quiet elder who walked beside him, not in the way, but in witness. And as the morning light began to stretch across the stone floor of the monastery, he made his way to the small tea room near the rear courtyard. Master Hojin was already there. Of course he was. But today he wasn't seated in meditation. He wasn't delivering teachings. He was pouring tea, carefully, slowly, like each drop meant something. Kai bowed as was custom and sat across from him. Hojin didn't speak. He simply slid a cup across the table, steam curling like a ribbon toward the ceiling. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Then, as the tea cooled just slightly, Hojin began. "The Buddha," he said, "once stopped in the middle of a long walk. He was traveling with his disciples, and they were asking him many questions, teachings, doctrines, the path to liberation. Kai listened closely, his hands warming around the cup. And suddenly, Hojin continued. He sat down beneath a tree, just like that, in the middle of a dusty road. And he said nothing. The disciples waited. At first, they thought perhaps he was contemplating. But minutes passed, then an hour. Still, the Buddha said nothing. Until finally, Ananda, his closest attendant, leaned forward and asked, "Master, why have you stopped?" And the Buddha, still looking into the distance, replied, "Because I am tired." Kai blinked. That was it? The enlightened one, he who saw through illusion, who mastered the mind, who taught the Eightfold Path. He simply stopped because he was tired? Master Hojin smiled gently. Even the Buddha, he said, knew when to stop walking. He sipped his tea. The difference between the awakened and the restless, he added, is not that one never grows weary, but that one knows when to honor that weariness. Kai looked down into his cup. The steam had thinned now. The liquid inside was still clear. It reflected his face, but softer than before, less demanding, less performative. The wisdom wasn't in the stopping alone. It was in not apologizing for it, in knowing that pause is part of the path. In our world today, rest has become transactional. We rest so we can get back to work. We meditate so we can be more productive. We take breaks so we can bounce back stronger. But the Buddha didn't sit under that tree to recover. He sat, because in that moment the path meant stillness. If the Buddha, Hojin said, can stop in the middle of a sacred journey, why can't you stop in the middle of your schedule? Kai didn't answer. He didn't need to. The question wasn't meant for the mind. It was meant for the part of him that had, for too long, believed that worth must be earned through motion. And in this morning ritual of nothing more than tea and truth, Kai realized he had been trying to outrun his humanity. And now he didn't have to. He could sit, he could stop, and he could be, without proving anything at all. And here's the most beautiful part. The Buddha didn't lose the path when he sat down that day. He became the path. Because sometimes the most awakened thing you can do is to stop walking. Part 7, When Growth Looks Like Stillness. The final bell of morning had long faded. The monastery moved as it always did, in quiet cycles of prayer, cleaning, reflection. Birds darted across the tiled roof. Bamboo stalks whispered ancient things no one could quite understand. And Kai sat once more in the meditation hall. But this time, something was different. He was not trying to sit still. He was not trying to be mindful. He was not even trying to feel peace. He was simply here. No goal, no identity, no seeking. The floor beneath him felt just as it always had, cool, solid, unwavering. But now, for the first time, he felt the same way. Unwavering, not because he was unshakable, but because he was no longer afraid of being shaken. You see, when we first enter the path of healing, we imagine it as motion, progress, better habits, deeper meditations, brighter moods. But the truth is far gentler, far less glamorous. Real healing often feels like nothing is happening at all. It feels like sitting in silence and wondering if you're doing it right. It feels like waking up tired but no longer blaming yourself. It feels like no longer performing peace, even if chaos is still dancing in your mind. Growth sometimes looks like stillness, like a seed underground, like winter trees with bare branches, like Kai, sitting with his eyes closed, not chasing breath, just being breathed. He remembered something Master Hojin had said over tea the day before. You're not tired because you're broken. You're tired because you are becoming. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. Kai wasn't behind. He wasn't failing. He wasn't lacking energy because he was spiritually weak. He was simply shedding the identity of the perfect monk, the unshakable student, the peaceful one, the always okay one. He was letting go so something truer could arrive. And perhaps you've felt it too, that quiet kind of tiredness, not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that only honesty can touch. You wake up and you feel it, the weight, the fog, and you wonder what's wrong with me. But nothing's wrong with you. You are not malfunctioning. You are metamorphosing. And just like the caterpillar in the cocoon, this moment of stillness, this not knowing, this not moving, is not a pause. It is a becoming. Kai opened his eyes, not suddenly, not dramatically. He simply opened them the way dawn opens the sky, softly, without rush, without needing anything to happen. He rose from his cushion. There was tea to prepare, wood to carry, a day to live. But now, none of it felt like effort, because he had remembered something Buddhism had whispered all along. You are not here to become perfect. You are here to become present. And when you are truly present, the tiredness begins to lift, not because the body is recharged, but because the soul is no longer resisting itself. So if you, too, have woken up tired, not just in body but in being, let this be your gentle reminder. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are simply in the part of your journey where rest is the most sacred form of growth. Let it be enough. Let stillness do its quiet work. Let the soul remember what the mind forgot, that sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is stop trying to be spiritual and just breathe. So maybe you're still tired, but not in the same way anymore. Maybe now you can see that this tiredness isn't your failure. It's not laziness, not weakness, not something to hide. It's just the weight of everything you've been holding on to. And maybe, just maybe, you don't need to carry all of it anymore. Let this story be your gentle reminder. You don't always need more sleep. You don't always need to do more. Sometimes what you truly need is to stop performing peace and let presence rise on its own. So if your soul ever feels worn down by simply being, you're not alone, and you don't need to fix yourself to belong here. You already do. If the story brought you even one breath of relief, subscribe, like, or share it with someone quietly carrying too much. We'll be here, in the stillness between the stories, waiting, with tea and silence,